You can never find a tuna standing still in the ocean because if they stop, they will die. They can live up to 40 years and can be sold for twice the price of the latest Rolls-Royce Phantom. So how do fishermen catch and process them? And how much profit do they make from these expensive fish? Many tuna species are found all over the world's oceans. But the most impressive are skipjack and bluefin tuna, each using different fishing methods. Skipjack tuna are the smallest but most abundant, accounting for 70% of the total tuna catch in the Pacific Ocean. They often move in large schools near the surface, so purse seining is the most common fishing method for large tuna industries, such as the Philippines. Catching skipjack tuna takes several days as there is a lot to prepare. Tons of ice and other supplies are transported to the mothership, about 11-hour boat ride away. On the next day, the fishermen prepare the fishing grounds. The goal is to gather as many fish as possible in one area. So floating objects like coconut leaves are often used because fish naturally congregate in what they perceive as shelters. Buoys are anchored in place on the seabed with ropes hundreds of meters long. A diver also has to go down to check the ropes. This is a very laborious teamwork process, and if the ropes get tangled, it will take another hour. The captain marks all locations with GPS. Then they repair the nets for the rest of the day to prepare for the big catch tomorrow. The main fishing day starts early and takes about 3 hours to do. First, the fishermen lower a large net into the water, creating a vertical wall that encloses the fishing ground prepared yesterday. Colored water and a canoe are used to confuse the fish. Then they pull it back to trap the fish in a tighter area. Now, a smaller net called a brail is used to scoop up the fish in the large net. It can open at the bottom and release the harvested fish into the ice water boxes. There are several boxes on board. Each can contain up to 27,000 pounds of fish. In 2022, the Philippines is estimated to have harvested 484 million pounds of skipjack tuna using this method. The mothership will repeat this entire fishing process in another area to catch more fish. Meanwhile, a smaller boat will bring some of the harvested fish ashore. Freshness determines the selling price of skipjack tuna, so ice is constantly added. In addition to the purse seine fishing method, the ancient technique of catching skipjack tuna with rods and lines is now also used industrially. Flocks of birds gathering on the surface are a good sign that there is a school of fish there, and this is how fishermen have located tuna for centuries. Bait fish are scattered around the boat to attract skipjack tuna. The boat sprays water behind it to trick skipjack tuna into thinking smaller fish are being chased. This method may seem like a lot of work to catch just a few fish, but 22,000 pounds of skipjack tuna can be harvested in just 15 minutes with a crew of about 15 to 30 fishermen. This technique also reduces bycatch, sea creatures caught by accident. Since fishermen only go after fish near the surface, it doesn't hurt the animals that live deep down in the ocean. Once ashore, the skipjack tuna are weighed and sold to fishmongers at local markets. Each small fish weighs about 7 ounces, and buyer's minimum purchase is a 30-pound box. But most of the fish caught are sold to Thailand, the world's largest canned tuna industry, for around $1,800 to $2,000 per 2,000 pounds in 2023. At the factory, skipjack tuna are washed with cold water. Then they are placed in a tray and steamed. The steaming temperature will vary depending on the size and number of fish. Once done, they are left to dry and cool down. Workers then manually remove the skin, head, red meat, and bones. Depending on the order specifications, which dictate the proportion and type of cut, the worker will cut large to make large pieces and small to make shredded tuna flakes. The meat is now put into cans by machine, but the worker still has to weigh it again to make sure each can is equal. Then, vegetable oil, brine, and sometimes flavorings are added. After that, the tuna can is sealed shut, rinsed and stacked together to go to the heat sterilizer. Once sterilized, the tuna can is cooled before moving on to labeling and packaging within a week. In 2023, the total export value of canned seafood products from Thailand reached nearly $2 billion, with $1.6 billion coming from canned tuna. In contrast to skipjack tuna, bluefin tuna is the largest and most expensive tuna species. This giant 525-pound bluefin tuna was sold for nearly $800,000 on the first business day of 2024 in Japan. That's roughly $1,500 per pound. These bluefin tuna can cross the Atlantic Ocean in just 1 month. And they are commercially caught primarily using trolling. This method involves towing around lures or bait with fishing rods placed in rod holders and using the boat's speed to catch them. It sounds simple, but controlling the enormous power of this giant fish is not easy. Heavy-duty rods, reels with robust drag systems, and braided fishing lines with minimal stretch are crucial in controlling the tuna's runs and preventing snapped lines. One of the key factors in trolling is choosing the fishing location. Experienced fishermen nowadays use sonar technology that can easily help them locate schools of fish at different depths. The boat maintains a steady speed, usually between 7 and 10 knots, while the trolling lines are deployed at the back. A sudden pull on a line breaks the quiet tension. The fisherman must simultaneously reel in the line and allow controlled runs to avoid losing the fish. After over 4 hours, the fisherman can finally bring the bluefin tuna closer to the boat. The intense run can heat up the bluefin tuna's body so much that it can burn its own flesh from the inside. This reduces the meat quality significantly. But a practice called swimming the fish can prevent this. The fisherman will secure the fish alongside the boat, then cut its gills to facilitate faster blood release and remove lactic acid buildup from the muscles. Once the fish dies and cools down, the fishermen bring it aboard and preserve it with a lot of ice. For commercially caught bluefin tuna in the US, each is carefully tagged and measured to report to fisheries authorities. Then it's gutted and the flesh is assessed based on color, texture, and fat content within a few days. This particular fish was a giant, weighing a hefty 845 pounds and stretching 10 feet long. But it only got sold for $3.50 a pound, which is much less than some smaller tunas. This is because the fish wasn't fatty enough. Typically, smaller tuna cores under 350 pounds are sold to Japan for a higher price, but fishermen have to cover the shipping costs. Because of rising costs in 2024, most US bluefin tuna are sold domestically. Japan is the world's largest consumer of bluefin tuna because they love it in sashimi and sushi. The first stop for these fish here is at famous auction markets like Toyosu Market. Skilled tuna buyers use their knowledge of how tuna are built to maximize yield and maintain the quality of each cut. The most prized bluefin tuna cuts are those with high fat content, like the extra fatty belly toro and the fatty belly otoro. These are meticulously cut and used in the most expensive dishes. The Japanese processing method strives for minimal waste. Even parts like the head and bones of the bluefin tuna are used to create flavorful broths or other specialty dishes. Hello my friends. During the winter holidays, this is a good time to consider a table full of hearty oyster dishes. Oysters have held an important place on our dinner tables for centuries. But have you ever been curious about their origin? In today's video, we learn how American fishermen produce millions of pounds of oysters each year. In 2023, the United States will produce 45.3 million pounds of oysters worth about $221 million. Oysters are typically produced in one of three different ways: natural, managed, and farmed. Natural oysters grow and reproduce without human intervention and are generally available for harvesting by anyone with the appropriate license. In contrast, managed oysters are monitored by harvesters, who periodically scrape the layers to reduce aggregation. For farmed oysters, fishermen often use traditional methods. They transport immature oysters to artificial beds where they continue to grow. In many parts of the world, oysters are grown on lines or in tanks, and this method is now being adopted in some regions of the United States. In eastern North America, oyster farming efforts began a century ago to restore over-harvested oyster beds and improve yields. Oysters spawn in the summer when the water warms. This is the beginning of the oyster farming cycle, where fishermen will collect microscopic larvae. They provide a place for young oysters to settle and grow. Specifically, these oysters were purchased from Fisher's Island hatcheries and carefully managed in a nursery environment. The nursery is the intermediate stage for oysters to grow from 0.5 inches to nearly 1 inch. At this time, they will be introduced to farms, live in open water, and they will grow to market size. When they reach 1.5 inches, fishermen will transfer them to bags to fatten them up for the winter. Raise livestock but do not need to provide food. That's right, oysters are that kind of livestock. They can develop on their own without needing too much support from humans. In fact, once past the larval stage, oysters do not need to be fed because they filter food from the water column. In recent years, bottom cages have become a popular solution in the oyster farming industry. Oysters live on pieces of shell that are finely ground in the nursery before being put into cages. After that, the cages are submerged in water at rented locations at the river mouth for rearing. Vertical, multi-tiered cages allow farmers to grow more oysters. Additionally, oyster farming provides valuable estuarine habitat for juvenile fish and invertebrates. Oyster farms have transformed flat, unattractive estuarine habitats into more complex habitats. At the same time, it invites commercially and ecologically important species to forage and seek refuge. In Alaska, oysters grow in cold water with abundant plankton, so high-quality oysters are available year-round. Cold water also reduces bacterial contamination, prolongs storage time, and ensures safety when eating raw oysters. However, because they cannot reproduce either naturally or in the wild, all farmed Alaska oysters are imported as seed from hatcheries on the Pacific coast. These cages contain more than 30 million oysters. These tiny oysters are very difficult to maintain. They need constant care or the entire oyster crop could be wiped out. The best conditions for oysters to grow are between 60 and 80 degrees F. Before oysters spawn, farmers will control the temperature in the water tank to prepare them for the best environment. When oysters spawn, they release eggs and sperm directly into the water. After being put into the tank, they turn into larvae. About 1 billion oysters are born in these tanks each year. After placing baby oysters in nets, fishermen will anchor them in the ocean or on the beach. Here, oysters feed by filtering naturally occurring plankton in the water. During this period, farmers also regularly monitor the weather, because if there is too much rain, it will dilute the salinity in the water and affect the oysters. Depending on the type of cage, fishermen have a way to allocate the number of oysters accordingly. Oyster farmers with many years of experience often redistribute the number of oysters in the cage when the oysters reach average size. They want to reduce the quantity so they can achieve high quality before they reach the market. By removing oysters from high-density cages, about 85 to 90 oysters per cage. Then the farmer divides it equally among 3 different cages. The oysters return to the cages with more space to move and grow better. As the cold grey dusk begins to creep across the calm river, fishermen are trying to remove the layer of sand around the oyster shells and return them to the sea. They believe that the cleaner they keep them, the more water will flow into that shell. It takes about 18 to 36 months for oysters to grow to market size. After 6 months, the cage is removed from the water and the oysters are taken to the production facility. Here, machines will sort them by size. Those that meet standards are exported to the market, while the remaining small oysters will be released into the sea. Potential sites for oyster farms need to have good tides so that food can be easily transported to the site and waste discharged into the ocean. Of course, oyster farms must be close to seafood distribution markets. Weaving along the icebergs, the boat entered the oyster farming area. They pulled the oysters out in the 7-degree cold. The harvesting process was harsh, but also filled with pride, because they kept the area supplied during the winter. Farmers quickly brought the oysters to market so that when people ate the oysters, they would feel a little taste of the Maine coast. Similar to Maine, in Arcachon Bay, oyster farming is a part of daily life for locals. Oyster farmers will take you to their oyster beds to flip the bag of oysters, then release them into the water or harvest them. Sounds easy, right? But in reality, this work is quite difficult. Oyster farmers have to spend hours underwater, rotating the oyster cages manually. Some oyster farmers have used technology to do this effectively. This idea also allows farmers to harvest more easily. They just stand on the boat and open each cage one by one. After decades of processed oysters, eating fresh oysters in the shell is increasingly popular. Like wine, oysters are famous for taking on the characteristics of the surrounding climate. So that's great if you live in New England and love oysters. New England oysters grow from cold, fertile waters, which gives them a particularly pleasant, umami-filled flavor. Now let's go on a journey to catch these natural oysters. At about 5:30, when it was not yet dawn, he set off, deciding to follow the GPS to look for oyster beds to exploit. Similar to a gentle warm-up, before the sun even appeared, he harvested the first batch of oysters. The work went on continuously until about 12 o'clock. He drove the boat back and sold them. Interestingly, oysters cannot move. Not a jot. They float down the stream, cling to rocks, and stay there for life, if all goes well. The oyster has a rich flavour, conveying the crisp, fresh saltiness of its pristine environment. In addition to being delicious and nutritious, oysters also play a role in maintaining healthy ecosystems. They filter their food, removing particles and pollutants such as excess nitrogen from the waters where they live. Additionally, because oyster larvae survive by clinging to hard surfaces, oysters also help rebuild coral reefs. The sun was setting, and he steered his boat in a slow circle in San Antonio Bay before harvest. Fishermen began pulling up traps, chopping small blocks of oysters with axes and sorting them right on the boat. They make most of their money in a year by harvesting oyster reefs. In April, the oyster season ends with exciting activities. It was the last week of the fishing season, and they needed to move faster, getting bigger hauls of oysters. In 2023, the state allowed each oyster boat to haul about 50 bags or crates per day. They must implement that quota to protect markets and resources. Unlike oyster farming, oyster fishing is based on luck. Natural oysters will also not have the same appearance and size as farmed oysters. But in return, oysters grown in a natural environment bring a different flavour. At the same time, fishermen do not have to spend huge costs on raising livestock. Once the oysters are harvested, it's a race against time to get them safely to consumers. Quality oysters are washed, tagged with ordering information, and canned. Besides, fishermen will add ice and place them in the cooler for about 2 hours to meet FDA guidelines. Trucks will transport them to stores and distributors across the United States. Finally, they appear on the dinner table like this, and you can pay 40 cents to enjoy each oyster.